She gave her last $20 to a homeless man in the rain, and he turned out to own half of Seoul. What happens next broke the internet, and it will break your heart. This is the story of a woman who had nothing, a man who had everything, and the single act of kindness that changed both their lives forever. If this story moves you, hit that like button right now, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now sit down, because this one doesn't let go. The $20 were folded so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases, almost like cloth. Imani Carter had been carrying that bill since Tuesday. It was now Thursday night. She'd been carrying it the way you carry something you know you're going to have to let go of eventually, carefully, with the specific grief of someone who has already done the math and doesn't like the answer. She stood under the narrow metal awning outside the GS25 on Mapodairo and counted what she had left in her wallet for the fourth time in 20 minutes. The counting didn't change anything. It never did. She had 4,081 in coins, the soft 20, and a debit card she already knew was sitting at $11 in change after the international transaction fees ate what little remained of her paycheck. The rain came down in cold, indifferent sheets. October in Seoul had no interest in being gentle. She was trying to decide between the triangle kimbap and the instant ramen. The kimbap was cheaper, but the ramen was more filling, and she had a split shift tomorrow. Morning at the Hagwon, where she taught English to elementary kids who called her Teacher Imani, in accents that made her chest do something complicated. Then an evening shift bussing tables at the Galbi restaurant on the next block where the owner, a stout woman named Mrs. Huang, watched her like she was expecting something to go missing. The ramen would hold her longer. She was reaching for it when she saw him. He was sitting on the wet pavement 6 feet from the entrance, his back against the wall, legs stretched in front of him. He wore a black hoodie that had absorbed so much rain it had stopped looking like clothing and started looking like a second skin. His head was down, not sleeping. She could tell the difference between sleeping and the particular surrender of someone who has stopped expecting anything from the next 5 minutes. She'd seen that posture before. She'd worn it herself, once, in a Greyhound station in Nashville when she was 19 and her connecting bus was 6 hours delayed, and she had $40 and no plan. She stood in the rain and looked at him for a long moment. She had learned to stop doing this in big American cities. You had to, eventually, or it would hollow you out. Atlanta had taught her to look straight ahead, but she wasn't in Atlanta, and there was something about the way he sat. Not hunched, not broken exactly, but still, like a man who had made a decision to stop moving and was waiting to see what happened next. She bought the kimbap. Then she stood at the register and looked at the 20 in her hand and made the specific kind of decision that poor people make sometimes. The kind that doesn't come from calculation, because calculation would always tell you not to do it. It comes from somewhere the math can't reach. She bought a second kimbap, a bottle of barley tea, and a pack of wet wipes. The total came to 9,001. The cashier, a teenage boy with headphones around his neck, gave her the change without looking up from his phone. She walked back outside. The man hadn't moved. She crouched down next to him. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she'd first thought. Or maybe not younger, but not the age she'd assumed. He wasn't an old man beaten down by decades. He was somewhere in his 30s, with a strong jaw and dark circles so deep they looked structural, like they'd been there long enough to become part of his face. His hands rested on his knees. His knuckles were scraped. Not fresh scrapes, older ones, halfway healed, the kind you got from something you didn't want to explain. "Hey," she said. He looked up slowly. His eyes were very dark and completely steady, which surprised her. She had expected the glassy unfocus of exhaustion or drink. Instead, he looked at her with a directness that was almost unsettling, the look of someone who had been watching everything from the ground and missed nothing. She held out the kimbap and the tea. "You should eat something," she said. Her Korean was rough, functional, assembled from 6 months of classes and necessity. "It's cold." He didn't take it immediately. He looked at her hand, then at her face. "You don't have to," he said. His English was precise and almost unaccented, which she noted and filed away without comment. "I know," she said. "Take it anyway." He took it. She straightened up. She was already getting wet again. She'd used up the shelter of the awning. She reached into her pocket and held out the folded 20. There's a Jimjil Bang 2 blocks that way, she said, nodding east. Bathhouse. It's not fancy, but it's warm, and they'll let you sleep. Should cover the entrance fee. He looked at the money. He didn't move to take it. That's yours, he said. Yeah, she said. Now it's yours. Come on, I'm getting soaked. She set it on his knee when he still didn't reach for it. Then she pulled her jacket tighter and walked away because if she stood there long enough, she would talk herself out of it, and she didn't want to be that person tonight. The rain hit the back of her neck and ran down her collar. She made herself not look back. She didn't see him watch her go. She didn't see the way his hand closed around the folded bill. Not with urgency, but carefully, like it was something fragile. She didn't see him reach into the front pocket of the soaked hoodie, past the ramen wrappers she'd assumed were trash, and pull out a phone that was not a cheap phone, not anything close to a cheap phone. A matte black device with no case, military-grade encryption, the kind of phone that costs more than her monthly rent in Atlanta. She was already half a block away when he raised it to his ear. The call connected in 2 seconds. Director Seo. His voice was flat. No inflection. The voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Sir? The voice on the other end was careful, ready. There's a woman. She just left the GS-25 on Mapo Daero, heading south. Black jacket, natural hair, American. A pause. Find out everything. Don't approach her. Don't let her see anyone. I want a full profile by morning. He ended the call. He sat for another moment in the rain, the $20 bill held loosely in one hand, the kimbap in the other. He looked at both for a long time. Then he looked in the direction she had gone, though she was already invisible in the darkness and the rain. Something in his face shifted. Not softened, that wasn't the right word. Cracked, maybe. Like a wall that had taken one hit in exactly the right place. He opened the kimbap and ate it slowly, in the rain, alone. His name was Kang Tae-hyun, and he had not sat on a wet sidewalk since he was 7 years old, when his father had locked him out of the house in November to teach him something about weakness. He remembered that he had not cried. He'd sat down against the wall of the compound, pulled his knees to his chest, and waited. 4 hours. When the door finally opened, his father had looked down at him and said, "Good. A king doesn't beg." He had carried that lesson like a stone in his sternum for 25 years. The Kang syndicate had been operating in South Korea for 3 generations. By the time Tae-hyun took control at 27, following his father's death in circumstances that were never officially classified as suspicious, but that everyone with sufficient context understood perfectly well, it had grown into something that no longer resembled what his grandfather had built. The old man had run numbers, protected neighborhoods, extracted fees from businesses that wanted to stay intact. Simple transactions. Violence as punctuation, not as the whole sentence. Tae-hyun's father had expanded aggressively, violently, without discrimination. He made enemies faster than he could neutralize them and compensated with brute force, which meant he was always managing chaos instead of building anything. By the time he died, the organization was enormous and deeply unstable. A machine that consumed resources and generated fear, but had no coherent architecture, no long game. Tae-hyun had spent 5 years rebuilding it from the inside. He was methodical in a way his father had never been. He cut the operations that were needlessly exposed. He moved money through legitimate channels, real estate development, private equity, a logistics company that moved freight and asked no questions about contents. He cultivated law enforcement relationships not through bribes, which were traceable, but through the more elegant mechanism of selective information. He knew things. He chose carefully what to share and with whom. In exchange, he became difficult to prosecute. By 32, the Kang syndicate controlled more than 2 trillion won in assets, employed, directly and indirectly, thousands of people, and operated with a degree of institutional invisibility that his father would have found incomprehensible. Tae-hyun had not built a criminal empire. He had built a system. The distinction mattered to him, though he understood it would matter to no one else. He had also, in the course of building it, become someone he did not always recognize. He thought about that sometimes, late at night in the penthouse on Yowido, where he slept maybe 4 hours on a good night, lying in sheets that cost more than most people's monthly salary and staring at a ceiling that cost more than the sheets. He thought about the precise moment when he had stopped being a person navigating a world and started being a weight pressing down on one. He could not identify the moment. It had not been a single decision. It had been 1,000 small calibrations, each one rational, each one defensible, and the sum of them something that could not be defended at all. His grandmother, Madame Kang, was the only person who talked to him about this directly. Everyone else who worked for him, including Seo Min-jun, his underboss, his closest thing to a friend, operated in the register of operational reality: problems, solutions, risks, resources. Madame Kang operated in the register of what was actually happening to him, which was different and considerably less comfortable. She had been diagnosed with a form of cancer that had spread too far by the time it was found. The doctors gave her 3 to 6 months. She gave herself until she was done saying what she needed to say, and then she would decide. 3 weeks before the night in the rain, she had called him to her room at the private medical facility in Gangnam, where she was being kept comfortable. She was 81 years old and had seen everything the world could produce and was not impressed by most of it. She looked at him for a long time without speaking, the way she always did, that unnerving assessment that made him feel like a man being accurately described. "You have no one," she said finally. "I have the organization." "I said no one." She paused. "Sarah is gone. She made the correct decision for herself. You should not be angry at her for it." "I'm not angry at her." "You're furious at her." She let that sit. "But not for the reasons you think. You're angry because she proved something you already believed, that no one chooses you. They choose what you control." He said nothing. Outside the window, Seoul glittered with complete indifference. "I want you to do something for me," she said, "before I'm done." "Anything." "Disappear. 30 days. No title, no protection, no money. Take enough to survive, nothing more. Go live in the city like a man who has nothing, and see what finds you." She watched him. "I want to know if there's anyone left who would see you. Not the Kang syndicate, not the building behind you, just you." He had started to say it was impractical. She cut him off with a look. "I'm dying," she said. "You can manage the practical." He had argued. He had explained carefully why 30 days was too long given current organizational pressures. She had looked at him with an expression that contained no give whatsoever. He had agreed. He told Seo Min-jun that he was going on an extended operational withdrawal, which was code for something Min-jun would decode correctly. That Taehyun was making himself invisible for a designated period and would check in at intervals, and that Min-jun was to manage the organization in his absence and to maintain discreet surveillance at a distance. Min-jun had nodded without comment. He was good at that. Taehyun had taken 40,000 won in cash, which was roughly $35, and enough to eat cheap and sleep in Jim Jill bangs if necessary. He'd taken his encrypted phone, his ID, and a single change of clothes in a battered backpack. He dressed in the most anonymous clothing he owned, which turned out to still be too clean, so he deliberately walked through a construction site before heading into the streets, dragging the fabric against things until it lost that unearned quality. He'd spent 11 days on Seoul's streets before she appeared. In 11 days, he'd had 2 conversations that lasted more than 3 minutes. One with an elderly man named Mr. Choi, a former army medic who slept in a cardboard shelter near the Mapo Bridge and wanted to talk about the 1990s and a daughter who'd moved to Canada and stopped calling. The other with a drunk university student who'd sat beside him on a bench at 2 in the morning and told him his girlfriend had left and then fallen asleep mid-sentence. In 11 days, he had been walked around, stepped over and looked through by hundreds of people. He had been handed a church pamphlet by a teenage volunteer who made brief eye contact and then immediately moved on. He had been ignored so comprehensively and so consistently that it had begun to produce something he did not have language for. Not loneliness exactly, because he'd been lonely inside his penthouse. Something more specific, the particular sensation of not existing. He'd been sitting outside the GS-25 for 2 hours. He was not hungry. He had eaten. He'd sat down because he was tired, and because the wall was solid, and because something about sitting on wet pavement in the dark had begun to feel, paradoxically, more honest than standing in his own building giving orders. He did not expect anything. Then Amani Carter crouched down beside him and held out kimbap and tea like it was the most obvious thing in the world. He found out her name at 6 the next morning when Minjun's report came through on the encrypted phone. He read it twice, then set the phone down on the floor of the Jim Jilbong sleeping room and looked at the water-stained ceiling. Imani Carter, 26, Atlanta, Georgia. Arrived Seoul 8 months ago on a teaching visa. EPIC program placement at a hagwon in Mapogu, renegotiated down to part-time when the placement school's enrollment dropped. Supplementing income with restaurant shifts. Bank accounts, both Korean and American, critically low. Sending roughly $400 monthly to a younger sister, Deja, 18, who is finishing her senior year and preparing for college applications. Mother deceased 3 years prior. No other immediate family. Living alone in a 9-pyong studio in Ahyeondong that cost more than it should have for its size, because it was the only place that had taken her on short notice when her original housing fell through. No relationship to the Kyong syndicate. No relationship to any organized interest in Korea. Nothing in her background suggesting anything other than exactly what she appeared to be. A young woman a long way from home, working 2 jobs, sending money to her little sister, running on close to empty. She had given him her last $20. He sat with that fact for a long time. The water-stained ceiling offered no interpretation. He formed one himself, slowly, with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust first impressions, but who recognized, occasionally, when something was simply what it appeared to be. He went back to the same GS-25 that night. He didn't know if she would come back. He thought she might. The restaurant was nearby. The convenience store was on what looked like a regular route. He sat on the same stretch of pavement, not with any clear plan, operating on something he didn't examine too carefully, because examining it would require admitting things about himself that he had efficiently buried. She came back at 9:47. She was wearing the same jacket, carrying a plastic bag of leftovers from the Galbi restaurant. The staff meal, he guessed. The thing you got at the end of a shift in a restaurant like that. Not a choice, but a consolation. She stopped when she saw him. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You didn't go," she said. "Not yet." She sat down. Not beside him exactly. A foot away, leaning against the same wall, facing the same stretch of wet street. She opened the plastic bag and took out 2 sets of metal chopsticks and a container of rice with galbi scraps on top. She set half of it on his side without asking. "Long shift?" he said. "They always are." She picked up her chopsticks. "You speak English?" "Yes." "Where'd you learn?" A pause. He adjusted the answer with the efficiency of a man accustomed to editing himself in real time. "School. Long time ago." She accepted this without pushing. They ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, which surprised him. Most silences he sat in had a texture, expectation, assessment, the particular tension of people who wanted something from him and were waiting for the right moment to want it. This one was just silence. "I'm Imani," she said eventually. "Taehyun," he said. Just the first name, just the 2 syllables she could hold on to without the rest of it. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Originally." "Here," he said. "Seoul. You?" "Atlanta." She ate a bite. "Long way from home." "You came alone?" "Yeah." She said it without self-pity, just information. Seemed like the right thing at the time. A pause. "Still does, mostly." He looked at her. She was eating carefully, rationing, he noticed, taking smaller bites than hunger would dictate, making the food last. She did it unconsciously, the way you do something when you've done it long enough that it stopped being a choice and become a habit. "Why Korea?" he asked. She thought about it. "I needed to go somewhere that didn't already have a version of me in it," she said. "Somewhere I didn't have history." She glanced at him. "You ever feel like that? Like the place knows too much about you already?" He thought about the penthouse, the building with his name on the corporate registry, the city that held the record of everything his family had done in it for 3 generations. "Yes," he said. They sat until the rain started up again, harder, and she finally gathered herself to go. She looked at him before she left. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, which was not a question exactly. More of an offering. He said yes before he decided to. She left. He sat in the renewed rain and thought about the word yes and how infrequently he said it without a calculation behind it. They fell into a rhythm over the following 2 weeks that had no name because they'd never agreed to anything. Just the same wall, the same hours, the same particular quality of conversation that happened when two people had nothing to prove to each other. She brought food when she had it. He found, after the second night, that he was looking for things to bring too, not buying them, not yet, because that would change the texture of what this was. But noticing when there were things left on benches or tables outside the convenience store that people had abandoned. He learned things about her that Min-jun's file could not have contained. That she made a small sound when she was thinking. Not a word, just a hum. A frequency she seemed unaware of. That she moved her hands when she talked about her sister, Deja, and kept them very still when she talked about her mother. That she had a way of looking at a problem, not panicking, not performing stoicism, just sitting with it quietly and then making a decision and not second-guessing it much. He recognized that quality. He had trained himself to do something similar, but in her it wasn't trained, it was native. She knew less about him because he gave her less. He gave her the shape of a man who had made mistakes, who had been in a world that demanded things from him he hadn't been built to give, who had ended up here after a series of events he was not specific about. It was all true. He simply omitted the scale of it. But there were nights when the conversation went somewhere he hadn't anticipated. When she asked him something with that direct, undeflectable quality she had, not aggressive, just present. And he found himself saying true things that he had not said to anyone in years. About his father. About what it costs to earn a thing by other people's loss. About the specific loneliness of rooms full of people who needed you to remain a particular version of yourself. She listened to these things without the particular quality he'd learned to expect from people who found out pieces of who he was. Without calculation, without the unconscious repositioning toward what might be useful. She just listened and occasionally said something that landed sharp and clean that he kept turning over for hours afterward. One night, a Tuesday in the third week, she told him about the day her mother died. She told it plainly. No performance. Her mother had been sick for 2 years, a slow decline, and Imani had been in Seoul for 3 months when it happened. She hadn't had the money to fly back immediately. She'd had to wait 4 days for the flight to become affordable enough. By then, the funeral had already happened. Deja was 16, she said. She kept calling me, and I kept saying, I'm coming, and I was coming. I just couldn't. She stopped, looked at her hands. I wasn't there for the part that mattered. He didn't say anything right away. He'd learned across these nights that she didn't always want something said. Sometimes she just wanted it heard without being immediately resolved. After a while, he said, You're here now. For her. I'm sending money, she said. There was an edge in it, not at him, at herself. That's not the same as being there. No, he said, but it's not nothing either. She looked at him. That direct, steady look that he had come to understand was not evaluation but recognition. She was checking whether he was saying something true or something meant to make her feel better. He held her gaze and let her look. No, she agreed eventually. It's not nothing. He walked home, to the Jimjilbang, to the sleeping room with the water-stained ceiling, thinking about his grandmother, about the 30-day experiment she had sent him on, about what she had said. She had said, find someone who would choose you if you had nothing. He was beginning to understand that he had misread the assignment. He had thought it was a test of whether such a person existed. He was starting to think it was a test of whether he could still be reached by one. On the 27th day, Min-jun called at an hour that meant something was wrong. Taehyun stepped away from the wall. He and Imani had been sitting outside the convenience store, deep in the middle of something, and answered with the controlled calm he defaulted to in operational contexts. What? He said. Yun se ra, Min-jun said. He said it the way you say a name when the name is a problem. She's been asking questions about the Mapogu area, about a woman. Taehyun went very still. How long? 2 days that I can confirm, maybe longer. A pause. She has access to people who watch our people. She would have noticed the low-level surveillance protocols on... Yes, Taehyun said. He understood. If Sarah had noticed that Min-jun was running quiet surveillance in a specific neighborhood, she would have traced it eventually to its purpose. And Sarah had enough connections, enough remaining access to the periphery of the organization's information networks to pull a thread if she found one. What does she know? He said. Unknown. She hasn't moved yet. Minjun's voice was careful. But she will. He ended the call. He stood on the wet sidewalk 10 feet from Imani and calculated the radius of what was about to happen. 3 days. Maybe 4 if Sarah was being careful. Then everything he had allowed to become real over these 27 nights was going to become visible. And he was going to have to watch the moment when Imani Carter looked at him and understood that the man she had been eating staff meals with in the rain was not the man she thought he was. He turned around. She was watching him from the wall. Not alarmed, just observant. She'd noticed the shift in him and was waiting for him to come back from wherever the call had taken him. He sat back down. He thought about telling her. He opened his mouth once and closed it again and hated himself, precisely and specifically, for the closing. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said. It was the only lie he had told her in 27 days. And it was the worst one, because it wasn't a lie about a fact. It was a lie about time. He was borrowing days he hadn't earned, and somewhere across the city, a woman who had reason to be cruel was about to collect. He sat beside Imani Carter in the rain and said nothing and watched her hands move while she talked, and thought about the specific kind of damage that well-intentioned cowardice produces. 3 days. He didn't stop it. Jits. It was a Wednesday evening, the 30th day exactly, when Imani came to the wall and he knew from the way she walked that something had already happened. She didn't sit down. She stood in front of him and in her hand was her phone, and on the phone's screen was a photograph. He recognized it immediately. It was from 18 months ago, a corporate event, himself in a suit, surrounded by the specific context of men who arranged themselves a certain way around power. His name was in the caption, his full name, his title. He looked at the photograph. He looked at her face. She wasn't crying. He had almost expected crying because that would have been easier to navigate. Instead, she looked like someone who had taken a hit and was still standing, which was much harder to watch. "How long have you known her?" Her voice was even. It cost her something to keep it even. He could see the cost. "Yun Sera," he said. Not a question. "She found me at the restaurant. She was very—" Imani stopped. "She was very polite about it. She laid it all out like she was doing me a favor." A pause. Maybe she was. He stood up from the wall. She took a step back. Not fear, distance. The specific distance of someone recalibrating. "Imani, you let me give you my last $20. Her voice cracked on the word last, and she stopped and reset. "You sat there. You took it. You watched me be—" She shook her head. "You watched me." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you tell me?" He thought about the answer. He'd had 30 days to prepare one, and he had nothing clean. "Because it would have changed everything," he said. "And I needed—" He stopped. "I needed it to not be changed. For a little longer." "You needed," she repeated. Flat. "Okay." She looked at the phone screen again and then put it in her pocket like she was putting away something sharp. "So what was this? You deciding if I was worth— what? A charity case? A story you could tell?" "No." "What then?" "A test," he said, and immediately understood it was the wrong word. He saw her face change. "A test," she said. "That's not—" He pressed his hand to the back of his neck. He had not fumbled like this in years. He had never fumbled like this in his life. "My grandmother, before she got sick. She asked me to find out if there was anyone who would see me. Not what I control. Me. She wanted to know if I was still the kind of person that someone would see." "And how'd that go?" "Cold. You fed a stranger in the rain," he said. "You gave away money you needed. You didn't ask me anything." He looked at her. "You sat with me for 30 nights, and you never once tried to get anything from me." "That's because I thought you had nothing," she said. "I thought you were—" She stopped. Something moved through her face. "I thought we were the same." The silence that followed that sentence was different from all the previous silences. It had weight. "You spent money on me," she said quietly. "All those nights you brought things. That wasn't small things. Nothing that mattered financially. It mattered to me." Her voice was unsteady for the first time. "Because I thought you were—" She shook her head. "God, I was sharing my staff meal with the richest criminal in Seoul. I fell in love with you, he said. She looked at him. He said it again because it was the only true thing left to say. I fell in love with you, not because you passed anything, because you sat down next to me like I was worth sitting next to, and you talked to me like I was worth talking to, and you never once. He stopped. His voice had done something it hadn't done in a very long time. He let it do what it was doing. No one has done that in longer than I can account for. She stood in the rain. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned and walked away. He watched her go. He did not follow. He stood against the wall of the GS-25 on Mapodaiero, in the place where she had found him 27 days ago, and let her go, because he understood with the clarity of a man who had spent a career making cold decisions that some things cannot be taken back. Some things you do, and they cost exactly what they cost. And following her would not change the cost. It would only add to it. He stood there until the rain got heavier. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Min-jun, your grandmother is asking for you. You should come now. He looked at the screen. He looked at the direction Amani had gone. He looked at the rain falling into the city that held everything he had ever built and everything he had ever lost. And he understood with a precision that felt almost medical that the next 24 hours were going to take things from him that he could not recover. He walked toward the car that he knew Min-jun had waiting 2 blocks away. He was not wrong. The car was a black Genesis G90 with tinted windows and no plates visible from the street. Min-jun was in the front passenger seat. He didn't turn around when Taehyun got in. He'd learned, over 8 years of working for this man, that the first 60 seconds after Taehyun entered any vehicle were not for conversation. He looked straight ahead and let the driver navigate back toward the Han River Expressway and waited. Taehyun sat in the back seat and watched Seoul slide past the window. The rain made the city look like a photograph taken slightly out of focus, all neon blur and black water, the kind of city that looked beautiful from inside a car and showed you something different when you were sitting on the pavement looking up at it. He hadn't changed out of the soaked hoodie. How long? He said. 32 minutes since she was admitted to intensive care. Min-jun's voice was controlled. He'd practiced that control the way Taehyun had practiced other things. She's stable. But the doctor said, a pause. He said you should come prepared. Taehyun said nothing. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the car door's armrest and felt the leather give under the pressure. Outside the window, the Han River appeared as a black expanse between the bridges, reflecting nothing. Sarah, he said. Yes. How much did she give her? I don't know the full scope of what she shared. I know she had photographs, corporate registry documents. The Mapodaiero surveillance I ran. Sarah had access to the analyst who ran the initial location trace. He was sloppy. She would have identified the parameters. Min-jun turned his head slightly, not quite looking back. She moved fast. She's always moved fast when it comes to you. Taehyun thought about Sarah's face the last time he had seen it, the specific quality of her absence, the way she had looked at him in the final weeks of what they'd had together, that appraising distance that came when someone was already measuring the exit. He had told himself at the time that he understood it, that he didn't blame her. Mostly that was still true. What he felt right now was closer to a specific kind of fury that had no clean target. Did anyone approach Carter after Sarah? He said. No, I pulled back all proximity surveillance when I realized Sarah had identified it. There's no one near her. A pause. She went home, alone. He thought about Amani going home to the Ninepyeong studio in Yeongdong. He had never seen it, but he had read the description in the file enough times that he could construct a version of it. Small, probably cold this time of year. The particular silence of a person alone in a place that doesn't quite fit. He thought about her sitting with everything Sarah had put in her hand and doing what she did. That still, quiet sitting with a problem before deciding what to do about it. He thought about the word test and how wrong it had sounded in his own mouth. Don't watch her, he said. Not tonight. Not any night this week. Min-jun was quiet for a moment. Sir, did I say something unclear? No. Then we're done with that. The hospital was a private facility in Apgujeong, the kind of building with no signage visible from the street, with an underground entrance and a staff that had signed NDAs and understood what the Kang family's continued patronage meant for the facility's operational budget. The doctor who met him in the corridor was a careful man in his 50s named Park, who had been managing Madame Kang's care for 4 months, and who looked at Tae-hyun now with the specific expression of a man delivering news he has rehearsed. The progression over the last 48 hours has been significant, Dr. Park said. The primary concern is respiratory. We're managing it, but… He stopped. She's been awake. She's been asking for you since this afternoon. How long does she have? Dr. Park didn't look away. He said, days, possibly less. Tae-hyun nodded once. He walked past him toward the room. Madame Kang looked smaller than she had 3 weeks ago. That was the first thing. The way illness progressively returned a person to something essential and stripped, the bulk of a life's accumulation falling away until what remained was just the core of them. She was smaller, but her eyes were the same. Dark and still and containing the specific quality of a person who had decided to stop being impressed by circumstances. She looked at him when he came in. She looked at the soaked hoodie. Her mouth moved. You look terrible, she said. Her voice was thin, but the dryness in it was intact. Did you sleep in the street? Some of it. He pulled the chair to the side of the bed and sat. The 30 days? Today was 30. She looked at him for a long time. The monitoring equipment beside the bed produced its quiet, regular sounds. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular sweetness of dying that he would not have had words for before this year. Tell me, she said. He told her. Not all of it. Not the file. Not Sarah. Not what had happened an hour ago in the rain. The shape of it. A woman who fed him in the rain. 30 nights of convenience store walls and staff meals. What it had felt like to be talked to like a person. Madame Kang listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Did you tell her? Not until it was too late. Ah. She closed her eyes briefly. That sounds like you. She left. Of course she left. Not unkindly, simply a statement of cause and effect. What do you expect, Tae-hyun? You constructed something that wasn't honest and then lived inside it, and when it fell apart, you were surprised. I wasn't surprised. You're here in wet clothes at midnight. You're surprised. She opened her eyes. What do you feel? He looked at his hands, like I lost something that I didn't have enough time with. That's called grief, she said. It means it was real. A pause. She shifted slightly against the pillows and did not mask the small sound that cost her. The question is what you do with real things when they break. Some people leave them broken. Some people… She stopped, breathed carefully. Some people understand that broken is not the same as finished. He looked at her. You're going to tell me to go after her. I'm going to tell you to be honest, she said, which you haven't been for so long that I imagine it will be very uncomfortable. A faint movement that might have been a smile. Good. You're overdue. He stayed until 2 a.m. She fell asleep partway through something she was saying, and he sat in the chair beside her and listened to the machinery measure her remaining time in small, regular increments, and thought about honesty and what it would cost. He didn't go to Ayondong. He went back to the penthouse on Yeouido for the first time in 30 days and stood in the entrance of his own apartment like a stranger assessing the place. It was vast and cold and immaculate. The cleaning service came twice a week regardless of whether anyone was there. Floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over the river. Art on the walls that he had purchased because someone told him it was significant. Furniture that had no memory of anyone sitting in it. He stood in the middle of the living room in the soaked hoodie and understood, with the particular clarity that exhaustion and loss will sometimes produce, that he had been living in a museum of himself. His phone had accumulated 43 messages in 30 days of minimal checking. Most were operational. Minjun keeping things moving, subordinates seeking approvals, lawyers forwarding documents. 3 were from Sarah, sent over the past 72 hours. He opened the last one. I did you a favor. You can be angry if you want. She wasn't going to last. You know that. He read it twice. He thought about what it revealed, not about Sarah's cruelty, which he had already calibrated, but about her accuracy. She was wrong about Imani. She was not entirely wrong about him. He had been running an experiment on a woman who didn't know she was in one. Whatever his intentions, that was the shape of it from the outside, and the outside view was the one that mattered to the person standing in it. He put the phone down. He did not respond to Sarah. He showered for the first time in 30 days in the way that only a 30-day absence earns. Standing in the marble enclosure for a long time, doing nothing, the hot water running until the tanks hesitated. He changed into clean clothes that felt wrong after a month of anonymous fabric. He sat at the kitchen counter with a glass of water and thought about what Madame Kang had said about Broken not being finished. Then he thought about Imani's face when she'd said, "I thought we were the same." He hadn't been able to answer that because there was no version of it that didn't hurt her more. She didn't go to the wall the next night. He hadn't expected her to. He didn't go either. He had been back in the penthouse 2 days, re-entering the operations of the organization with the controlled efficiency that kept it running, taking calls, reviewing the backlog of decisions that had accumulated in Minjun's holding pattern. He was present and he was functional, and something under the surface of all of it had changed in a way he couldn't articulate even to himself. On the third day, Sarah called. He let it ring twice and then answered because letting it go to voicemail with Sarah was a delay, not a resolution, and he had limited appetite for delays right now. "I heard about your grandmother," she said. Her voice was careful, composed. She had always composed herself well. It was the first thing that had drawn him to her, years ago, that ability to walk into any room and immediately determine its architecture. "I'm sorry. Are you?" A brief pause. "Yes. Whatever you think of me, I respected her." "She didn't respect you, Aung," he said, not harshly, informatively. "She said you made the correct decision for yourself. That's not respect, that's assessment." The silence on her end had a particular quality. "You want to fight," she said. "I want to understand why you went to her." "Because you were going to get hurt." Her voice changed slightly. Something cracking the composure, not emotion exactly. Something older and more complicated than emotion. "You were sitting on the street letting a woman you don't know see you in a way you never let me see you. And you weren't going to come back from that clean. You never do anything clean. So you decided to damage her instead. I decided to be honest with her, which is more than you were." He breathed out through his nose. She wasn't wrong. He already knew she wasn't wrong. What made this conversation costly was that Sarah knew exactly how to be right in a way that still did harm, and she had never resolved that in herself. "Is there something you need from me, Sarah?" he said. "Or is this what it is?" A pause. "I need you to know that I wasn't trying to, She stopped. "I didn't do it to hurt you." "I know," he said. "You did it because you still think you know what's right for me. You've always done that." A beat. "It's why this ended." He ended the call. He sat at the desk in the study, the room with the bookshelves and the good lamp and the window that faced west, away from the river, toward the city's dense interior, and thought about what it meant that the two people who had known him best in the last 3 years were his ex-fiancée, who operated from a love that expressed itself as control, and a woman who had given him food in the rain and asked nothing, and then walked away when she found out the ground had shifted under her. He picked up his phone and opened a message window with Imani's number. He had it from Minjun's file and had never used it, and felt the weight of that now, the line between having information and using it. He typed, "I know you don't want to hear from me. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I just want you to know that everything I said that last night was true. Not the omissions. The things I actually said." He looked at it for a long time. He deleted it. Whatever came next was not going to happen through a text message sent from a penthouse that cost more than she made in 5 years. If it happened at all, it was going to happen honestly and in person, and he did not know yet if she would allow that. He was going to have to wait and find out, and he was not good at waiting, but he was going to do it because it was the only option that didn't add to the damage. Imani was not doing well. She would not have said this to anyone because she was not in the habit of saying it, but the evidence was accumulating in the small ways. The way she'd oversalted the lesson prep she was doing at midnight. The way she'd stood in the shower Tuesday morning for 20 minutes and then sat on the bathroom floor in a towel. Because the next step after that, the whole sequence of the day had suddenly looked very long. She'd sat there for 8 minutes. She knew because she'd stared at her phone's clock the whole time, watching it. Like watching it would make the sitting mean something it didn't mean. She taught. She bussed tables. She sent $400 home to Deja and then looked at her remaining balance and calculated how many shifts it would take to not feel this specific way about it. What she could not stop doing was going back to that night in her head and taking it apart. Not the revelation, though that had its own ongoing damage. The nights before. The convenience store wall and the shared food and the conversations she'd thought were real. The problem was that she couldn't locate the lie. That was the part she kept arriving at and couldn't get past. She could find the omission, the enormous deliberate omission, the whole missing ocean behind a single politely withheld name. But she could not find a moment where what he had said to her was false. The things he told her about his father, about rooms full of people who needed you to remain a particular version of yourself, about the feeling of not existing, those had not been manufactured. She'd spent 6 months in Seoul developing a sense for manufactured things, because that's what you developed when you were a young black woman alone in a foreign country who could not afford to misread people badly. She had read him, and she had read him correctly. She just hadn't read all of him. That was the fracture line. Not that he had lied to her, that he had let her build something on partial ground. On the 5th day, she called Deja. Deja was 18 and finishing her last semester of high school and had the specific energy of a person at the edge of something enormous. She also had the specific instinct of a younger sibling who had watched Amani closely for 26 years and knew the sound of something wrong. "You okay, Mo?" she said, before Amani had said anything beyond hello. "I'm fine." "Amani." "I met someone," Amani said. A pause. It got complicated." "What kind of complicated?" "The kind where I thought I knew who I was dealing with, and I didn't know the full picture." Deja was quiet for a moment. "Did he hurt you?" "Not," Amani stopped, thought about it honestly. "Not the way you mean. He let me believe something that wasn't entirely true, by leaving out a lot." "So he lied." "By omission." "Which is lying, Mani." "I know." She was sitting on the floor of the studio, her back against the bed, looking at the wall opposite. "The thing is, I can't figure out if what was real between us was actually real, or if I just..." She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye. "I don't know. Maybe I wanted it to be real." "Tell me what happened." She told her the shortened version. The man in the rain, the 30 nights, who he turned out to be. Deja listened without interrupting, which she was not usually good at, which meant she understood the weight of it. When Amani was done, Deja said, "Okay, so he's rich. He's not just Deja, he runs a criminal organization." "I heard that part. I'm asking separately about the rich part because those are two different things to be upset about." Imani made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The criminal part seems like the bigger problem." "Does it, though? Or is the bigger problem that you thought you were equal and you weren't?" A pause. "Because those are also different things." Amani looked at the wall. This was the problem with calling Deja. She had inherited their mother's inability to leave the accurate thing unsaid. "Both," Amani said finally. "It's both." "Okay," Deja said. "Fair." A pause. "Do you still like him?" "Deja, I'm asking because the answer is going to determine everything else." Amani sat with the question. On the wall there was a small water stain shaped like nothing in particular. She had looked at it a lot in the past 5 days. "I don't know who he is," she said. "That's not what I asked." She closed her eyes. She thought about the wall outside the GS-25. The particular quality of that silence between them. The things he'd said about his father that had no performance in them. The way he'd said, "I fell in love with you," standing in the rain, with his voice doing something he seemed as surprised by as she was. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I still like him." "Then you need more information," Deja said, "before you decide anything." "It's not that simple." "I didn't say it was simple. I said you need more information." After the call, she sat on the floor for a while longer. The water stain on the wall did not offer anything useful. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary evening, indifferent to the geography of what she was trying to figure out. She thought about her mother's hands, the way her mother had held things, difficult things, painful things, without clenching. She had always thought that was a kind of patience she didn't inherit, but she'd given her last $20 to a stranger in the rain, which suggested she'd inherited something. She just hadn't calibrated yet what that something was worth when tested like this. On the 6th day after the wall, Min-jun called Tae-hyun at 7 in the morning. "There's a situation," he said. Tae-hyun was already awake, had been awake since 5, sitting at the window with a coffee that had gone cold. "What kind?" "Yoon Byung-ho." A pause waited with the specific gravity of that name. "He's moved up the timeline. We're looking at a meeting request for Friday that we don't think is actually a meeting request." Yoon Byung-ho was Se-ra's uncle. He ran the Yoon operation out of Busan, and for the past 8 months he had been testing the edges of the Kang territory with the patience of a man who believed he had time on his side and was waiting for a moment of structural weakness to push. He and Tae-hyun had maintained a formal détente for 2 years, the kind that required continuous maintenance and the right combination of demonstrated strength and strategic restraint. "He knows I was off the board for 30 days, Tae-hyun said. "Yes. There was no way to keep that fully contained. He'll have assessed it as an opportunity." "And Sarah?" Another weighted pause. "She reached out to him 3 days ago. We intercepted it. The communication was..." Min-jun chose his words. "Informational. She shared the broad strokes of your absence and the context." Tae-hyun set the cold coffee down on the window ledge. There it was. The thing he hadn't seen clearly when Sarah called. She'd said she went to Amani because she was trying to protect him. Maybe a part of that was even true. But she had also, deliberately or not, surfaced information about his 30-day disappearance to a man who had been looking for exactly this kind of opening for 8 months. "She may not have understood what she was doing," Min-jun said. "She understood." "Sir, she understood," Tae-hyun said again, not loudly. "She's not careless. She chose to share it." He breathed. "The question is whether Yoon Byung-ho moves on Friday or whether Friday is a read. Our assessment is that Friday is a read. He wants to see how you respond to the meeting request before he decides the next move. If you decline, he reads weakness. If you attend without adequate preparation, he reads the 30 days as more destabilizing than it was." Min-jun paused. "You need to be back in the room, fully." Tae-hyun looked out the window at the river. Fully. That was the word. Back in the room fully meant the weight and the posture and the complete apparatus of being Kang Tae-hyun in the context that name occupied. It meant no more soaked hoodies on the pavement outside GS25, no more 30 nights of convenience store walls, no more the version of himself that had said, "I fell in love with you," while his voice did something he couldn't control. "Set the meeting," he said. "Friday?" "Friday." A pause. "And Min-jun?" "Sir, find out where Yoon Sarah is right now, not for any operational purpose. I want to know if she's safe." A beat. "I'll find out." He ended the call. He stood at the window and understood that the organization was pulling him back in the way it always did. Not with force, because it didn't need force, because it was built into the structure of who he had become and what he was responsible for. It pulled with necessity, with consequence, with the particular leverage of 1,000 people whose operational reality depended on him being present and functioning. He accepted it, as he always had. What was different this time was that accepting it felt like closing a door on something that had been, briefly and unexpectedly, open. He picked up the encrypted phone and looked at the unsent text to Amani that he had typed and deleted 3 days ago. He typed it again, shorter this time. "I need to tell you something. Not in a message. If you're willing, tell me where." He looked at it. He sent it. He put the phone face down on the window ledge and waited. 40 minutes passed. Then an hour. He took the meeting with Min-jun about the Friday preparation. He reviewed the documents that had accumulated. He ate something without tasting it standing at the kitchen counter. He checked the phone twice and put it back down. At 11:47, it buzzed. He turned it over. One line from an unknown number that had nonetheless texted him first, which meant she had his number from somewhere. And he thought, Min-jun's file, Sarah would have had the main line. Sarah would have included it. And one line said, Han River, Mapo Bridge, North Walk, 7 p.m. Don't bring anyone. He read it 3 times. Then something happened in his chest that the man he had been before 30 days of pavement would not have had language for. He was at the Mapo Bridge North Walkway at 6:45 alone in the first real rain of November, standing on the elevated pedestrian path, watching the river move below him, dark and fast and indifferent. She arrived at 7 exactly. She was wearing a different jacket, heavier, winter weight, the kind of coat you bought at a market stall because it was functional and cheap. And she had her hands in her pockets and her face was set in the particular way of someone who has made a decision and is not reopening it for discussion, but needs to say something before it gets sealed. She stopped 6 feet away from him. The rain was light, the kind that accumulated slowly. She looked at him for a long moment. "I have one question," she said. He waited. "Was any of it—" She stopped, looked at the river, came back to him. "Was any of it a performance?" He held her gaze. He said, "No." She looked at him the way she always looked at him, that direct, undeflectable assessment, checking for the thing beneath the thing. Then her phone buzzed. She looked down at it. Her face changed. Something in the change, the sudden pallor, the stillness that replaced the set jaw, made him take 1 step forward. "What is it?" She looked up at him, and in her eyes was something he hadn't seen before in all 30 nights. Not anger, not betrayal, not the careful steadiness she brought to difficult things. Fear. "It's my sister," she said. Her voice had gone flat in the specific way of someone managing shock. "She was in an accident. They're saying she's—" She stopped, looked at the phone again. "She's in surgery." She was already pulling up something on the phone. He watched her face do the calculation. How fast she could get to the airport. How much a last-minute international flight cost. How much she had. How much that left her short. All of it happening in the space of 10 seconds behind her eyes. She looked up at him. She was not going to ask. He could see that she was not going to ask, that every instinct in her was positioned against asking him for anything, and that the calculus was going to come out wrong, and she was going to go home to the Ninepyeong studio and figure out how to make numbers work that didn't. He made the decision before she finished the sentence. Not a calculation, not a measured assessment of risk and benefit. The decision came from somewhere below all of that, from the part of him that had sat on a wet pavement for 11 days and learned what it felt like to be seen, and had spent the last 6 days in the penthouse understanding what it felt like to lose it. "Give me the phone," he said. She looked at him. Imani. His voice was not a command. It was something else, something he'd had very little practice with. "Give me the phone and let me help you get home." I know you don't need it." He held her gaze. "Let me do it anyway." The rain came down between them. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, that assessment, that reading, and then she held out the phone. He took it. He looked at the message. A hospital in Atlanta, a number, the words critical condition in a text from someone named Marcus, who identified himself as Deja's boyfriend. He handed the phone back and pulled out his own. He called the private travel line directly. Not Min Jun, not through an intermediary. He gave the instruction himself, standing on the Mapo Bridge walkway in the November rain. A private flight, Gimpo to Atlanta Hartsfield, departed within 3 hours. 1 passenger, full medical coordination with the receiving hospital's administration to ensure her arrival was expected, and her access was unimpeded. He ended the call. She was watching him with an expression he could not fully read. Not gratitude, not the complicated mix he might have expected. Something more stripped than that. The face of a person who has run out of the energy required to refuse. "I'll pay you back," she said. "You won't," he said. "And we're not talking about that right now." He got her into the car that Min Jun had waiting at the bridge's south end. She walked beside him without protest, which told him everything about how frightened she was. Because the Imani Carter he had come to understand over 30 nights would not have gotten into that car without an argument under any circumstances that left her room to argue. The fear had taken the room away. In the car, she sat with the phone in both hands and texted back and forth with Marcus in the clipped, efficient way of someone managing crisis while their hands were not entirely steady. He sat beside her and did not speak, and did not crowd her and let her work through what she needed to work through. When they were 20 minutes from the airport, she looked up. "She's still in surgery," she said. "They don't know yet." "She's going to be okay," he said. She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "I don't." He held her gaze. "But she has a sister who got on a plane the same night. That matters." Something moved through Imani's face, and then she looked back at her phone, and he watched her breathe, slowly, the way you breathe when you're keeping something contained that would cost you to release in a car with a man you hadn't finished being angry at. At the airport, there was no line, no counter, no waiting. A woman in a gray uniform met them at the private terminal entrance and walked them through directly. He had been through this terminal 100 times and had never once considered what it looked like from the outside. Now he thought about the 11 days on the pavement and understood, without needing to articulate it, that the distance between those two experiences was not only money. It was a different relationship to the assumption of being accommodated. At the gate, she stopped and turned to face him. She looked at him for a long moment. The fluorescent light of the terminal was harsh and made everything very clear. "Why are you doing this?" she said. He thought about the answer. He gave her the true one. "Because you're scared, and because I have the means to make it smaller, and because I spent 30 days learning that doing something because you can, and because it's right, doesn't require more justification than that." She looked at him. He watched her recognize her own words in what he'd said. Not quoted, but absorbed, returned in a form that had passed through him and changed shape. "I haven't decided anything," she said, "about you, about any of this." "I know. This doesn't—" She stopped. "I'm not saying this means anything." "I know that too." She looked at him one more time. Then she picked up the bag that the gray uniformed woman had carried for her and walked through the gate. He stood at the terminal entrance and watched until she was gone. Then he stood there a moment longer, doing nothing, in the way that a man allows himself in private that he never allows in public. Then his phone buzzed with 6 messages from Minjun, accumulated over the past 40 minutes, and he walked back toward the car and back toward the life that had been waiting for him to return to it. Friday came the way bad Fridays always came, clear and cold and procedurally ordinary, which was how the worst things dressed themselves. The meeting with Yoon Byung-ho was set for 2 in the afternoon at a restaurant in Gangnam that both organizations had used for formal contact for 15 years, a yakiniku place on the 4th floor of a building that had no visible connection to either of them, run by a manager who was paid generously for discretion and who seated them in the private room in the back without being asked. Tae-hyun arrived 12 minutes early. He sat with his back to the wall. He had 2 men outside the building and 2 inside the restaurant service corridor. Minjun was at a table near the front with 2 others, visible enough to read, not close enough to read as threat. Yoon Byung-ho was 61 years old and had the particular physical authority of a man who had maintained himself precisely because he understood that physical presence was its own language in the rooms he occupied. He came in with 2 men, sat across from Tae-hyun, and spent the first 30 seconds simply looking at him the way old operators looked at people. Measuring, recalibrating, comparing the current version to the last recorded version. "You look rested," Byung-ho said. "I was," Tae-hyun said. 30 days is a long time to rest. Depends what you're resting from." Byung-ho poured tea from the pot that had been left on the table. He poured Tae-hyun's cup first, which was a gesture with specific meaning in this context, a claim of seniority, an assertion that he was setting the terms. Tae-hyun accepted the cup without comment. "I've been thinking," Byung-ho said, "about the Incheon logistics contracts." "I know you have. The arrangement your father set up was always provisional. Circumstances have changed." "Which circumstances specifically?" Byung-ho looked at him, a slow look. The kind that make people wonder if the people managing certain arrangements are still the right people to be managing them. There it was. Not a question, not even an accusation. A probe, positioned as conversation, designed to produce a response that would tell him what he needed to know, whether Tae-hyun was managing from strength or from a position that 30 days of absence had quietly hollowed. Tae-hyun set his teacup down. "The Incheon contracts are not provisional," he said. His voice was the voice he used in these rooms, not loud, not heated, carrying the specific weight of a man who did not need volume, because volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be listened to. "They're structural. Your interest in revisiting them tells me less about the contracts and more about what you think my 30 days means." "And what does it mean?" "It means I took 30 days. He held Byung-ho's gaze. "That's all it means." Byung-ho was quiet. He lifted his teacup. He looked at Tae-hyun over the rim with the careful eyes of a man running calculations. "Sarah tells me you found something interesting in Mapo-gu," he said. The temperature in Tae-hyun's chest dropped by several degrees, and he did not show it. Not a flicker. He had learned this, the absolute poker of the internal state, from his father, and it was one of the few things his father had given him that he did not resent. "Sarah talks too much," he said. "She's concerned about you." Byung-ho's tone had the particular quality of a man who had prepared this line and was now deploying it. Family concern. "She's not my family. She was going to be." A pause. "She still cares. In her way." "We're not talking about Sarah," Tae-hyun said. "We're talking about Incheon. If you have a specific proposal, make it. If you're here to read the room, you've read it. We can both go home." Something shifted in Byung-ho's face, not anger, something colder. The look of a man who had come in expecting to find a door open and had found it closed and was recalibrating whether to test the lock. "There's no proposal today," Byung-ho said. "Today is courtesy." "Then I'll return the courtesy." Tae-hyun stood. "Thank you for the tea." He walked out of the private room and through the restaurant and down to the street without hurrying, because hurrying was information he was not prepared to give, and Min-jun fell into step beside him at the building's exit without being signaled because Min-jun had been reading him for 8 years. In the car, Min-jun said, "He brought up the woman. He mentioned Mapo-gu." "That's not—" Min-jun stopped. "That's not the same thing as bringing up the woman." "He brought up Sarah," Tae-hyun said. "Sarah brought up Mapo-gu. The chain goes, Sarah told him about the 30 days, Sarah told him about the woman. Byung-ho is deciding whether the woman is leverage." He looked out the window. "The question is whether Sarah told him on her own initiative or whether he asked." Min-jun was quiet for a moment, then, "I think he asked." "Yes," Tae-hyun said. "So do I." The call from the Atlanta hospital came at 11 that night Seoul time, 10 in the morning, Atlanta. And it was not from the hospital. It was from Imani. He answered on the first ring. "She's out of surgery," she said. Her voice was wrecked, not crying, but the voice of someone who has been awake for 26 hours and has been holding something very tight for all of them and has just been given permission to let some of it go. "She's going to be okay. They said she's going to be okay." "Good," he said. He was sitting in the study with the good lamp on, in the quiet of the apartment at 11 at night, and something in him released a specific tension he'd been carrying since the bridge. "I'm glad." A pause. He heard her breathe. "Her leg," Imani said. "There was damage to the... They had to put a rod in. She's going to need physical therapy for months, but she's..." Her voice caught. "She's awake. She asked for me. She was asking for me before she even opened her eyes all the way." He said nothing. He held the phone and listened to her breathe from 8,000 miles away. "Thank you," she said, "for the flight, for the..." She stopped. "I'm going to stay a few weeks, until she's more stable. Stay as long as she needs." Another pause. "I still haven't decided anything," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know," he said, "but I wanted to tell you she was okay." A beat. "Because you..." "I don't know, because it seemed right." He sat with that for a moment. Because it seemed right. The way she said it, not as a concession, not as a beginning, just as a true thing she had done because it was true. "Thank you for calling," he said. She hung up. He sat in the study with the phone in his hand and the lamp making its small circle of light, and thought about rods and bones and phone calls made because they seemed right, and the specific distance between Seoul and Atlanta, and how distance was not only geography. The report from Min-jun came at 7 the next morning, and he read it standing at the kitchen counter with coffee he had not yet touched. It was 3 pages, and he read it twice, and then he set it down on the counter and stood very still. The report documented a financial movement, not large enough to be obvious, not small enough to be noise. 40 million won, shifted through a layered structure of shell accounts, tracing eventually to an account controlled by Yoon Byung-ho's Busan operation. The movement had occurred 6 days ago. The account it originated from was controlled by the Kang syndicate's internal trust structure. The account required dual authorization to access. There were only 4 people with that authorization. Tae-hyun was one of them. Min Jun was one. The organization's financial director, a man named Oh, was another. The fourth was Yoon Se-ra, whose authorization had been established 2 years ago during the period when she and Tae-hyun were engaged, and she had been positioned to assume a formal role in the organizational structure, an authorization that Tae-hyun had quietly moved to revoke after the engagement ended, but that had stalled in the legal architecture for 8 months because of the complexity of the trust structure and the fact that he had, in the particular way of a man who expected a former partner to remain at a certain distance, simply not forced the timeline. He picked up the report. He read the relevant page again. He set it down. He called Min Jun. "You've seen this," he said. "An hour ago." Min Jun's voice had the controlled flatness of a man managing his own reaction. "I wanted to verify before I brought it to you." "Verified how?" "The authorization signature was executed from a device registered to her. The timestamp puts it..." A pause. "While she was in contact with Byung-ho, 3 days before the Friday meeting." Tae-hyun stood at the kitchen counter. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seoul was doing its ordinary morning. Traffic building on the bridge, the river flat and gray under low cloud. The city looked exactly as it always looked. Nothing about it reflected what he was currently understanding. "She gave him the money," he said. 40 million won. Probably as a demonstration of access, a proof of concept. Min Jun paused. "It's not the money that's the problem." "No," Tae-hyun said. "It's what the money proves." It proved that she had maintained active authorization in the trust structure and had used it, which meant Byung-ho now knew 2 things. First, that the Kong internal structure had a person inside it who could move money with authorization. And second, that Tae-hyun had allowed that exposure to persist, which told him something about the 30 days and the nature of Tae-hyun's attention during them. It was not a theft. It was a signal, a demonstration, offered to Byung-ho as a credential, as a proof of usefulness. Sarah had shown him the open door in the wall. He had 48 hours, possibly less, before Byung-ho moved on that information. "Find her," he said, "already working on it." "Not to..." He stopped. He thought about what he was going to say next and what it would mean. "Bring her in, not through the organization, just you. I want to talk to her before anyone else does." A pause. "She doesn't get hurt. That's not negotiable." Min Jun understood the weight of the addendum. "Yes, sir." Tae-hyun ended the call. He stood at the window for a long time. He thought about Se-ra on the phone 4 days ago, saying, "I did you a favor." He thought about her voice on the call after that, the cracked composure, the "I wasn't trying to hurt you." He thought about the specific architecture of a person who had loved someone, lost them, and then rerouted that energy into something that looked like loyalty to herself, but was actually a sustained act of damage. He did not think she had gone to Byung-ho intending to dismantle the organization. He did not think she had gone to him intending to hand him a structural weapon. He thought she had gone to him angry and wanting leverage, and had given him more than she understood she was giving. That was the most dangerous kind of betrayal. Not the calculated kind, but the kind that came from a wound that hadn't been treated. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. "Min Jun. She's not at her apartment. Her car is there. Phone is going to voicemail." He looked at that. Then, below it, another message, 30 seconds later. "Min Jun. Her assistant says she had a meeting this morning. 8 a.m. Location." Then nothing. The message cut off. He called Min Jun back. The line rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Same result. He stood at the window with the phone in his hand and thought about the 40 million won and the open door and the Friday meeting where Byung-ho had read the room and found what he was looking for. And he understood with the cold precision of a man who had spent 5 years building a system that the system was now being tested from inside in a way he had not prepared for because he had made an assumption about Sarah that the evidence was currently dismantling. He was reaching for his jacket when the encrypted phone buzzed with an unknown number. He answered. A voice he didn't recognize said, "Mr. Kang, Yoon Byung-ho sends his regards. He has something that belongs to you. He'd like to discuss a new arrangement for the Incheon contracts." A pause. Professional, unhurried. "He suggests you come alone. He also suggests you come quickly because the thing that belongs to you has a timeline that Mr. Yoon controls." The line went dead. He stood in the middle of the apartment, in the silence of a building that bore his family's name, and understood with absolute clarity that in the space of 72 hours he had lost control of his organization's internal structure, given his primary adversary an operational asset, and allowed a woman who had once been inside his life to become the mechanism of his exposure, and that somewhere in Busan or in this city or in a location he did not yet have, Seo Min-jun was being held as the answer to a question Yoon Byung-ho was about to ask him. The question was whether Kang Tae-hyun, stripped of 30 days and a financial breach, and his closest operational partner, was still a man who could not be moved. He put on his jacket. He thought briefly, with a precision that surprised him, about Amani Carter in Atlanta, sitting beside her sister's hospital bed, 8,000 miles from this city, and this room, and this particular weight of what he had built, and what it cost. He thought about the $20 bill, still in his pocket. He'd been carrying it for 30 days and had not stopped. He reached in and felt the soft, worn paper between his fingers for exactly 3 seconds. Then he he took the stairs. Not the elevator. The elevator was a box with one exit and no options, and right now options were the only currency he had left. He took the stairs down 22 floors in the dark of the emergency stairwell, his footsteps controlled, measured, not running because running was panic, and panic was information he refused to broadcast even to an empty stairwell. He was thinking while he moved. The call had been professional, not threatening, not emotional, the voice of someone executing a task, which meant Byung-ho had organized this carefully and quickly and had people competent enough to pull Min-jun off the board within the window between the Friday meeting and this morning. That was fast. That was faster than Tae-hyun had assessed him capable of moving, which meant Byung-ho had been planning this longer than the Friday meeting had suggested, which meant the Friday meeting was not a red. It was a closing move on a sequence that had started weeks earlier. He reached the parking level. His personal driver was not there. He'd sent him home at midnight. The fleet vehicles were in the adjacent bay. He took the keys from the lockbox with the emergency code and chose the gray Sonata, not the black G90, because the G90 had a tracker on the company system, and right now he did not want to be a moving dot on someone else's screen. He drove. He called the only number he could call. Not Min-jun. Min-jun's phone was in Byung-ho's possession or at the bottom of the Han River. Not the organization's secondary line, because that ran through a switchboard Min-jun managed, and without Min-jun he didn't know who was on the other side of it right now. He called O, the financial director, the third authorization holder. O answered in 2 rings. He was awake. It was barely 8 in the morning, and he was awake, which meant he already knew something. The 40 million, Tae-hyun said, a breath on the other end. I saw it this morning when I ran the routine audit. I was going to... Did you move it back? I couldn't. The receiving account structure is layered. To reverse it, I need... Lock the entire trust structure, Tae-hyun said. Now, full freeze. Nothing moves, nothing authorizes, nothing breathes until I personally contact you with the secondary verification phrase. Sir, if I freeze the full structure, our operational accounts... Lock it, Tae-hyun said. Everything. A pause. Yes, sir. One more thing. He turned onto the expressway heading south, toward Gangnam, toward the last known geography of this situation. Sarah's authorization, pull it. Whatever the legal structure requires, do it manually, do it now, document it as an emergency revocation, today. Understood. He ended the call. He drove at a controlled speed and thought about Byung-ho's geography. The man was Busan-based but had maintained a secondary operational presence in Seoul for 3 years. A serviced office building in Seo-chogu, a private residential address in Hanam-dong, and a warehouse facility in the industrial belt south of the city that had appeared in surveillance reports twice in the past year. The phone call had come from an unknown number, but the professional tone, the unhurried pacing, the reference to a timeline, those were not the logistics of a man who needed to move a hostage far. Those were the logistics of a man who wanted proximity for the negotiation. He pulled over on a side street in Gangnam and opened the car's glove box. Behind the rental documents and the vehicle registration was a slim prepaid phone that he'd placed in every fleet vehicle 2 years ago after an operational situation that had taught him the value of redundancy. He powered it on. It had a single contact, a number he had not used in 18 months, belonging to a man named Kwan, who did private security work that he had never asked Min-jun to know about, because every organization needed edges that existed outside its own structure. Kwan answered on the fourth ring with silence. Hanam-dong address for Yoon Byung-ho, Tae-hyun said, and the Seoul office. I need eyes on both in the next 20 minutes. I need to know if there's unusual vehicle activity and if anyone's been moved in. I'll transfer the fee in the next 10 minutes. Use the account you gave me in 2023. A pause. 20 minutes. He ended the call. He transferred the fee from a personal account that existed outside the organizational trust structure, a small account, cash reserves he'd maintained for exactly the kind of situation where he needed to move money without it touching the organization's paper trail. Then he sat in the gray Sonata on a side street in Gangnam and made himself breathe. Min-jun had been with him for 8 years. He had found Min-jun in a situation where Min-jun was 23 and working for a mid-tier operator in Incheon, and had shown the specific combination of intelligence and loyalty and self-control that Tae-hyun had been looking for when he was rebuilding the organization's upper tier. He had trusted him with things that could not be trusted to most people. Min-jun had never once given him reason to revise that trust. He was not going to leave him in Byung-ho's hands. He also was not going to walk into whatever Byung-ho had arranged without information, because walking into unknown situations without information was how you became a body instead of a person. He waited. 17 minutes later, the prepaid phone buzzed. Kwan. Hanam-dong quiet. No unusual vehicles. Seoul office. 3 vehicles arrived 7:40 a.m. 2 sedans, 1 van. Van matches a Busan registered plate from your watch list. 4 individuals visible entering the building. Building should be empty. It's not a business day for the listed tenant. There it was. He drove to Seoul. The building was a 6-story commercial structure, the kind that housed small consulting firms and insurance offices and private medical practices. The architecture of legitimate business, which was the architecture Byung-ho had always preferred for his Seoul operations because it was boring, and boring was invisible. Tae-hyun parked 2 streets over and walked the perimeter once, hands in his jacket pockets, moving like a man who was in the neighborhood for a reason that had nothing to do with the building. He counted what he could count. 2 men at the building's main entrance who were not smoking or checking their phones, which meant they were working, not waiting. A third at the parking structure entrance. The van Kwan had identified was in the structure's lower level. He could see its rear end from the street. 3 visible, which meant more inside. He had no weapon. He had left the apartment in a jacket, and the organization's standard operational protocol was that he did not carry personally. He was always accompanied by people who carried for him. Right now, he had no people. He had the prepaid phone, the encrypted phone, the gray Sonata 2 streets over, and the $20 bill in his left jacket pocket. He thought about this for a moment, and then he thought about Min-jun, who was somewhere in that building on the wrong end of a situation that had a timeline. He called the number from the original call, the unknown number. It answered in 1 ring. I'm outside, Tae-hyun said. Tell Mr. Yoon I'd like to come in. A pause. 1 moment. 30 seconds. Then, come to the 4th floor. Use the stairwell entrance on the north side. Come alone. If we see anyone with you, the timeline moves up. He put the phone in his pocket and walked to the north stairwell entrance and went in. The stairwell smelled like cleaning fluid and old concrete. He went up 4 floors at a steady pace. His heart was doing what it did in these moments. Not racing, but hitting harder, each beat more distinct than usual, his body preparing itself with a specificity he'd learned not to fight and not to follow too closely. At the 4th floor, he pushed through the door. A man was waiting. Not Byung-ho. A subordinate, broad-shouldered, the physical type that operated in these organizations by virtue of presence rather than subtlety. He looked Tae-hyun over with the practiced efficiency of a search, patted him down quickly, found the phones and removed them both, found nothing else, and stepped back. This way, he said. They walked down a corridor of closed office doors. At the far end, double doors opened into what had been a conference room. Long table, chairs, windows overlooking the street below. The blinds were drawn. Min-jun was seated at one end of the table with his hands resting on the surface in front of him. His face was controlled, but Tae-hyun could read the specific quality of his stillness, the stillness of a man who had been managing fear for several hours and had gotten very good at not showing it. There was bruising beginning at his left temple. His jacket was gone. Tae-hyun looked at the bruise for exactly 1 second. He filed it and moved on because looking at it longer would change what was on his face, and what was on his face needed to be nothing right now. Yoon Byung-ho sat at the table's center. He had the posture of a man who had chosen his seat to communicate something, equidistant from everything, in control of the room's geometry. On either side of him were men Tae-hyun didn't recognize, which meant Busan personnel brought north specifically for this, which meant Byung-ho had been planning the logistics for at least a week. "Sit down," Byung-ho said. Tae-hyun sat, not at the far end, away from Min-jun. In the middle, across from Byung-ho, close enough to read his face. "You came alone," Byung-ho said, not surprised, assessing. "You told me to. Most men in your position would have found a reason not to follow that instruction. Most men in my position would have frozen their financial structure this morning, revoked all compromised authorizations, and come to this meeting with enough information to know exactly how many people you brought and where your van is parked," Tae-hyun said. His voice was level. "I'm not most men." Something shifted in Byung-ho's expression. Not fear, recalibration. He hadn't expected that opening. "The 40 million, Byung-ho said, is frozen, along with the rest of the trust structure. You have money you can't use in an account you can't access without triggering a forensic audit trail that would take you 18 months to unwind." Tae-hyun held his gaze. "You know this now because I'm telling you. You would have found it in approximately 4 hours when you tried to move it." Byung-ho was quiet. "Sarah gave you access to a door," Tae-hyun said. "She didn't know the door had been locked behind her. That's not her fault. She doesn't understand the full structure." He paused. "You should have done more due diligence before you used her as your key." "She came to me," Byung-ho said. "I know. She said you'd lost focus, 30 days off the board. A woman. She said you weren't—" He stopped. "She was concerned. She was angry," Tae-hyun said. "There's a difference. You use someone's anger as an intelligence source, and you didn't account for the distortion that anger produces." He looked at Byung-ho steadily. "That's a significant operational error for a man with your experience." The room was very quiet. One of the men beside Byung-ho shifted his weight. The man behind Tae-hyun was still, but Tae-hyun could hear his breathing, controlled, present, the breathing of someone ready. "Release Min-jun," Tae-hyun said. "Then we talk about what you actually want." "I decide the sequence," Byung-ho said. "You do," Tae-hyun agreed. "But consider the sequence from my side. I came here alone, with no leverage, no weapons, nothing except the information I just gave you. That's not the behavior of a man who has lost focus. That's the behavior of a man who is telling you that he is still the most dangerous person in any room he walks into, including this one, because he doesn't need anything in his hands to be dangerous." He let a beat pass. "The 30 days didn't weaken me. They reminded me what I'm doing this for." Byung-ho looked at him. "The Incheon contracts," he said finally. "We can discuss the Incheon contracts." "Not discuss, restructure." Byung-ho's voice had shifted. Still hard, but the quality of the hardness had changed. Less assault, more negotiation. A 30% share in the logistics revenue. Joint oversight of the route management. 15%. Single oversight, which is mine, with a quarterly reporting structure that gives your operation visibility without control. Tae-hyun paused. "And the Incheon port access fees your Busan operation has been paying to a third party for the past 2 years get consolidated into our arrangement, which saves you roughly twice what you're asking for in the restructure." A silence. Byung-ho looked at him with the expression of a man who has come in with a siege and found a negotiating table already set. "You prepared for this," Byung-ho said. "I prepared for the possibility of this 8 months ago when you first started testing the boundary. I updated the preparation on Thursday after our meeting." Tae-hyun kept his voice even. "I told you, the 30 days didn't cost me focus." Byung-ho was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to the man on his left and spoke in a low voice. The man stood, walked to Minjun's end of the table, and stepped back. Minjun stood. He looked at Tae-hyun. Nothing passed between them that was visible, but something passed between them. "Get outside," Tae-hyun said quietly. "The gray Sonata, 2 streets east. Keys are above the driver's side sun visor." Minjun walked to the door. The broad-shouldered man moved to block him, and Byung-ho said one word, "Let him," and Minjun walked through. Tae-hyun returned his attention to Byung-ho. "Sera," he said. Byung-ho held his gaze. "She contacted me. I used what she gave me. That's the extent of my involvement with her. I need to know she's not in a situation your people created. She's not." A pause. "She went to Busan this morning, voluntarily. She has family there." Tae-hyun breathed once. "The terms I outlined," he said. "I'll have the revised contract documents drafted by Wednesday. Your people and mine review it, we sign by end of week, and this situation is closed." He stood. "What happened today doesn't leave this room. If it does, the terms change significantly and not in your favor." Byung-ho looked up at him from his seated position. The power geometry of the room had shifted so completely in the past 20 minutes that it would have been comical if the bruise on Minjun's temple weren't still in Tae-hyun's peripheral memory. "You're a difficult man, Kang Tae-hyun," Byung-ho said. "Yes," Tae-hyun said. "I am." He walked out. Minjun was in the gray Sonata with the seat pushed back and his head against the headrest when Tae-hyun reached the car. He got in the driver's side. Minjun said nothing for 30 seconds. His breathing was the first thing that normalized. Tae-hyun could hear it settling, the specific deceleration of a body that had been running on adrenaline for hours and was beginning to understand that the immediate threat had passed. "Your temple," Tae-hyun said. "I've had worse." "I know. I'm noting it." Minjun turned his head slowly and looked at him. "How did you know they were in Seoul-chogu?" "Kwan." A pause. "The off-book contact." "Yes." Minjun looked back at the windshield. "You should have told me about him." "You're telling me this now?" "I'm telling you this now." Tae-hyun started the car. He pulled onto the street and drove north, back toward the river, back toward the city's center. Around them, Seoul was fully awake. Friday morning traffic, delivery trucks, a school bus stopped at a crosswalk with its yellow lights blinking. "Sera," Minjun said. "She's in Busan. She's safe." Tae-hyun watched the road. "She made choices. I made choices that created the conditions for her choices. We're not going to do anything about it. The authorization breach is documented, revoked, and will be part of the legal record if it ever becomes necessary. Right now it stays closed." He paused. She was angry. She didn't know what she was giving him. Minjun was quiet for a moment. "You're more generous than you used to be." "I'm more tired than I used to be," Tae-hyun said. "It looks similar." They drove in silence for a while. The Han River appeared ahead, broad and flat and moving, the same river it always was, regardless of what happened on its banks. "Your grandmother," Minjun said quietly. "I got an update while I was—" He stopped. "While I was in the building. The hospital sent the morning status to your organizational contact line." Tae-hyun looked at the road. "She's asking for you," Minjun said. "The doctor said this morning was—" He paused. He said today. Tae-hyun pressed the accelerator. She was awake when he arrived, smaller than 4 days ago. The monitoring equipment beside her bed had multiplied. More lines now, more things being measured, the body's final negotiations with the terms of its own departure. She looked at him when he came through the door, and her eyes were still the same. Dark and still and containing the assessment she had always directed at him, but different now. Softer. The assessment of someone who has already arrived at their conclusions. He sat in the chair beside her. He was still in the jacket he'd left the apartment in that morning. He had not slept. His hands, when he rested them on his knees, were steadier than they had any right to be. "You look like you walked through something," she said. Her voice was very thin. "I did." "The organization." "Yes." "Is it handled?" "Yes." She looked at him. "And the woman?" He was quiet for a moment. "She's in Atlanta. Her sister was in an accident. She's staying until she's stable." Madame Kang looked at him with those dark, still eyes. You helped her get there. Yes. Good. She breathed carefully. Each breath was deliberate now. He could see the work of it. Taehyun. I'm here. I'm not going to ask you to change who you are, she said. I never did. I only ever asked you to know who you are. All of it. A pause. The boy who sat outside in the cold because his father told him weakness was shameful. The man who built something enormous because he didn't know how to be small. And the version of you that sat on a wet sidewalk for 11 days and didn't pretend it was nothing. She paused. That last one is the real one. He looked at her hands. She had always had strong hands. The hands of a woman who had managed things, who had made decisions, who had held people together when they were coming apart. They were very small now. She gave you her last $20, Madame Kang said. Not because she saw who you would become to her. Because you were a person in the rain. A breath. That's the rarest thing. Don't let the rest of what you are make you forget you found it. He took her hand. She let him. They sat in the quiet of the room with the monitoring equipment making its small, regular sounds, and the morning light coming through the blinds in thin strips, and the city outside doing the ordinary business of being a city. And he held her hand and thought about rain and $20 and the particular courage of people who give what they have without calculating the return. Her breathing changed at 11:40. The doctor came. There were no dramatic moments, nothing that would have made sense as a scene in anything, just the gradual settling of something that had been in motion for 81 years, finding its rest. He sat beside her for a long time after. When he finally stood, his legs were stiff. He had been in the chair for hours. The room was the same room it had always been. The monitoring equipment had been silenced. The city outside the window was moving toward afternoon. He reached into his jacket pocket. He found the $20 bill. He held it in his palm and looked at it. The worn paper, the soft creases, the face of a dead president on currency from a country 8,000 miles away that a young woman had pressed into his hand because he looked like a person who needed it, and she had it to give. He thought about what Madame Kang had said. That's the rarest thing. He thought about Amani in Atlanta, beside her sister's hospital bed, doing what she did, making the next thing happen, holding the thing that needed holding. He took out his personal phone. He opened the message thread with her number, the thread that had only 2 messages in it, his request at the bridge and her response. He typed, "My grandmother passed this morning. I don't need anything. I just wanted you to know because you would have wanted to know." He looked at it. He sent it. He stood in the doorway of the room for a moment, looking back at the woman who had raised him and had asked him at the end, only to be known, fully, without the omissions that made everything more manageable and less true. Then he walked out into the corridor, into the building, into the city that held everything his family had built and broken and built again. And he understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has just lost the last person who told him the truth, that the next version of himself was going to have to be built on different material than the versions that had come before. His phone buzzed. He looked at it while he walked toward the exit. One message from Amani Carter, sent from Atlanta at the exact time the Seoul morning tipped into afternoon. "I'm so sorry." She sounded like someone worth. "I'm so sorry." She sounded like someone worth. He read those 5 words standing in the corridor of the hospital, coat still on, the afternoon light coming through the window at the end of the hall in a long, flat stripe across the linoleum floor. The message had cut off mid-sentence, the way messages sometimes did when a person was typing and then stopped because the thing they were trying to say was larger than what the sentence had room for. She sounded like someone worth. Worth what? He didn't ask. He understood that the cutoff was not an accident of technology, but a sentence that had found its own honest ending. Because what came after worth was everything, was the whole impossible weight of what Madame Kang had been. And there was no word large enough to finish it, and Imani Carter, who had a precise and undeflectable relationship with true things, had not tried to supply one. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, then he typed back, "She was. Thank you." He put the phone in his pocket and walked out of the building into the November afternoon. And for the first time in a day that had contained more than most years, he stopped moving and simply stood on the pavement outside the hospital and let Seoul exist around him. The traffic and the cold air and the smell of street food from a cart somewhere nearby, and the indifferent continuity of a city that did not pause for any individual grief, which was not cruelty, but was, in its way, a kind of comfort. He stood there for 4 minutes. He counted them without meaning to. Then he got in the car and drove. What? The following 3 weeks were the kind of weeks that did not have a texture you could describe to anyone who hadn't lived through something similar. The administrative grief of a death, which was its own specific cruelty, the way it filled the days with tasks so that the absence beneath them could be felt only in the moments between tasks, in the 3 seconds between putting down one piece of paper and picking up the next. He managed Madame Kang's arrangements himself, not through the organization's infrastructure, not through lawyers, not through the staff that could have handled all of it efficiently. He made the calls personally. He spoke to her remaining friends, 4 women in their 70s and 80s who had known her for decades, who cried on the phone in ways that were not embarrassed, which he found he respected. And he arranged the memorial gathering at the private garden in Seongbuk-dong, where she had kept a small house and spent her clearest mornings. The Incheon contract revision was completed and signed by Wednesday as promised. Byung-ho's people reviewed it, made 2 minor modifications that Tae-hyun's lawyers accepted, and the documents were executed without drama. The arrangement was not what either of them had come into the situation wanting, but it was workable, which was the realistic ceiling of most things. Sarah remained in Busan. He did not contact her. He thought about it once, in the middle of a night he couldn't sleep, sitting at the desk in the study, the room with the good lamp, and composing in his head the things he might say. He got as far as imagining her face when she answered the phone, and then he understood that there was nothing to say that would land cleanly, that everything true between them had already been said in pieces across difficult conversations, and that some things did not require a formal closing to be closed. He let it be. He texted Amani 4 times in 3 weeks. Once to ask about Deja's recovery, which was going well. The physical therapy was hard. The rod in her leg was doing what it was supposed to do. She was difficult and impatient in the way that people who are healing well tend to be difficult and impatient, which Amani described as genuinely exhausting and also the best sign possible. Once to send her the contact information for a financial services firm he used that had a division specializing in international education funding for Deja's college costs, framed as information only. Take it or leave it. Once to tell her that Mr. Choi, the elderly veteran from the Mapo Bridge, had been relocated to a stable housing program through a foundation that the Kang syndicate funded under an unconnected name because it had seemed like something she would want to know. And once, on a Tuesday night with no particular occasion, just, "How are you?" She had answered all 4. The last one she answered with, "Tired. Better. Figure I'll be back in Seoul in 2 weeks, give or take. Deja's gonna hate me for leaving, but she'll survive it." He read that and sat with it in the specific way he had developed over the course of 30 nights of convenience store walls for sitting with things that required him to be still rather than operational. Then he typed, "When you're back, if you're willing. There are things I want to say properly, in person." She took 6 hours to respond. He did not watch the phone. He put it in the other room and worked and came back to it and found, "Okay, 1 word, the same weight as yes." She landed on a Thursday evening, 14 days before December. He knew the flight, not because he'd arranged it, but because he'd asked and she'd told him, which was different and mattered. He did not go to the airport. He understood that the airport would have been too much context, too much of his infrastructure, too much of the gap between her world and his rendered visible in the way private terminals made it visible. He waited. She texted at 9 that night. "Back in a Hyundong, same terrible studio. Give me a day." He gave her 2. Saturday afternoon, she sent coordinates. Not an address, just the pin, which dropped in Bukchon Hanok village, in the hillside residential neighborhood with the traditional houses and the stone-paved lanes that Seoul had been protecting from development with varying degrees of success for 50 years. A public place. Neutral ground. The coordinates of a woman who had thought carefully about where she was willing to have this conversation and had chosen somewhere that belonged to neither of them. He was there before her. He stood at the top of a stone lane looking out over the city's low rooftops toward the distant glitter of the downtown skyline, which was a version of Seoul he had known since childhood, but which looked different to him now. He could not have said exactly why, except that everything you look at changes once you've spent time on the pavement looking up at it. She came up the lane at 3:15. She was wearing the heavy winter coat from the market stall, and her hands were in her pockets, and she looked like herself, the specific, unadorned version of herself that he had first seen crouching down beside him on a wet sidewalk with kimbap in one hand and $20 in the other. No performance of any kind, just her. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him. "You look better," she said. "Than what?" "Than the last time I saw you in person. On the bridge." A pause. "You had this thing in your face, like you were carrying the whole city." "I was," he said. "More or less." She looked out at the rooftops. A cold wind came up the lane, and she pulled her collar tighter. He said nothing and waited because he had learned, 30 nights ago, or maybe over the 3 weeks since, or maybe somewhere in the long quiet of the hospital corridor, that with Amani Carter, the best thing he could do was be present and not fill the space before she was ready to. "I talked to Deja about you," she said. "A lot, actually. She has opinions." "What kind?" "The kind you'd expect from an 18-year-old who watched her sister look sad for 3 weeks and needed someone to blame for it." A faint movement at the corner of her mouth. She also said, and I'm quoting here, "At least he got you on a plane the same night, which is more than most people would have done for someone they'd allegedly wronged." "Allegedly," he said. Her word. She's going to study law. I can already tell. He looked at the city. A child ran up the lane past them, laughing at something behind them, followed 30 seconds later by a breathless parent. The stone under their feet was uneven and very old and completely indifferent to the weight of any particular moment lived on top of it. "I need to say the thing I said I wanted to say properly," he said. She looked at him, that direct, undeflectable look. "The 30 nights," he said. "I know what they were to you. A man you found in the rain, someone you shared food with, a person you were building something with in the way you build things, which is carefully and without the performance of it. I know that when you found out who I was, it felt like the ground moved. I know that what I did wasn't only an omission, it was a construction. I built a version of the situation that kept me safe, and I let you invest in it, and I told myself it was because I needed to find out something true, and part of that was honest, but part of it was also that I was afraid that if I told you, you would go, and I wasn't ready for you to go." She said nothing. She was listening with her whole face, which was something specific to her that he had never seen in anyone else. The complete attention, unguarded. "I can't make that a smaller thing than it is," he said. "I'm not going to try. I did you damage and it cost you something real, and I'm sorry with the full weight of knowing exactly what I did and why, not with the version of sorry that asks you to make it easier for me." He paused. "That's the first thing." She breathed out slowly, a cloud of vapor in the cold air. "What's the second thing?" she said. "The second thing is that I'm not the same person I was when this started. Not because I met you, and it's not that simple, and you'd see through it if I said it that way. Because my grandmother sent me into the street with nothing, and I found out something about myself that I hadn't been willing to find out. And you were part of what I found. And then she died, and the organization tried to collapse, and I had to hold it together with less than I've ever had to work with, and I held it together. And when it was done, I was still—" He stopped. "I was still here. Still this. But different." He looked at her directly. "The third thing is that I want to know if there is any version of a future in which you and I figure out the rest of this together. Not easily. Not without the things that make it hard, the distance, the gap between what your life is and what mine is. All the things that would require both of us to make choices we haven't made yet. But actually, honestly, with the damage already on the table where we can both see it." The wind came up the lane again. Below them, Seoul moved through its afternoon with complete indifference to the stone lane and the two people standing on it and the specific weight of what was being negotiated between them. Amani looked at him for a long time. "You said you fell in love with me," she said, "in the rain, on the last night." "Yes. I've been thinking about that for 6 weeks." She looked at the city below. "I've been thinking about whether it was real or whether it was the idea of me, the woman who gave you $20, the uncomplicated version before you knew I was an actual person with an actual life that doesn't fit into yours cleanly." "It was you," he said. The actual person. The one who sat with things quietly and made decisions without second-guessing them and talked about her mother with completely still hands because she wasn't performing the grief. She was just carrying it. He paused. The one who called me after her sister's surgery because it seemed right. Not because it was strategic, not because she wanted something, because it was true, and she does true things. She turned and looked at him. He held her gaze without managing it, without the controlled stillness of the boardroom or the operational calm of a man who did not show his internal state. He let her see what was in his face, and what was in his face was what it was. "I'm still angry," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm less angry than I was, but some of it is still there. I know. And I live in a 9-pyong studio in Ahyeondong, and I teach English to kids who call me Teacher Imani, and I bus tables 3 nights a week, and I send $400 home every month, and that is my life right now, and it doesn't change because you have—" She gestured at nothing, at everything, at the invisible architecture of what he controlled. All of whatever that is. "I know that too. So what does together actually look like?" Not a challenge. A real question, the kind she asked when she genuinely wanted to understand something. Concretely. He thought about it. He gave her the honest answer, which was the only kind he had left. "I don't know all of it yet," he said. "I know that it starts with you knowing everything. Not the managed version, not the version that keeps you comfortable. Everything. The organization, the history, the things my family built, and how they built them, and what it costs to maintain it, and what I'm trying to change about it, and what I can't change yet, and what I might never be able to change." He paused. "I know that it doesn't ask you to become part of that world if you don't want to be. Your life is yours. Your 9-pyong studio is yours. Your kids who call you Teacher Imani are yours." A pause. "I know that I have enough to make sure Deja goes to the best program that will take her, if she'll let me, framed in whatever way doesn't feel like something you have to carry. And I know that every night you want to eat kimbap outside a convenience store in the rain, I would rather be there than anywhere else I have ever been." Something moved through her face, not the resolution of it, not the settling of everything into clarity. Something more complicated and more honest than that. The face of a person who has been given something true and is holding it carefully to see whether it holds its shape. She reached into her coat pocket. She took out her phone. She opened the Photos app and turned the screen to face him. It was a photograph of a small framed thing hanging on the wall of the Ahyeondong studio. He looked at it and understood it was a photograph she had taken of something she had framed and hung on the wall, which meant she had looked at it often enough that she'd wanted it there. It was the receipt from the GS25 on Mapodayero, the receipt from the night she had spent her last $20, the one the cashier had given her with the change he didn't look up to hand her. She had kept it. She had framed it. He looked at the photograph on her phone and felt something happen in his chest that he had no clean vocabulary for and had stopped trying to suppress. "I framed it the week after Sarah showed up," Imani said. Her voice was quieter now. "Because I kept going back to that night, and I needed to remember that the part that was true before anything else, before the 30 days and the omissions and all of it." She put the phone back in her pocket. "I went out in the rain, and I knelt down next to a man, and I fed him and gave him my last $20 because he looked like someone who needed it. That part was true. Whatever else got complicated, that part didn't." "No," he said. "That part didn't." She looked at him. "I still don't know what this looks like," she said, "and I'm still working through some of what happened, and I'm not going to pretend it's worked through just because we're standing here having this conversation. I know. But I'm not walking away." She said it plainly, the way she said things that were true, without elaboration, without ceremony. Just the fact of it, set down in the air between them. "I'm not walking away, and I need you to understand that that is not a small thing coming from me. Because I have walked away from a lot, and some of those times were right, and some of them were just easier than staying, and I know the difference." He looked at her on the stone lane in Bukchon Hanok village with Seoul spread out below them and the cold coming in off the mountain and the afternoon light beginning to change toward the particular blue-gray of a Korean November dusk. He reached into his left jacket pocket. He took out the $20 bill, the soft, worn, many times folded 20 that he had been carrying for 47 days. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. You kept it, she said. Every day since you put it on my knee. She looked at the bill in his hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she reached out and closed his fingers back around it, her hand around his fist, brief and warm and deliberate. You keep it, she said. It's yours. He closed his hand around it. They stood there for a moment in the specific quiet of two people who have finished saying the hardest things and have arrived somewhere that is not easy, but is real. The particular terrain of a thing that has been broken and is being rebuilt with the knowledge of how it broke, which makes it different from what it was before, and in some ways harder, and in some ways, if you are willing to be honest about what the breaking revealed, more solid. They walked down the stone lane together in the direction of the city. The spring came the way spring comes to Seoul. Not gradually, but in a series of sudden declarations, the cherry blossoms erupting overnight on the trees along the Cheon, the air shifting from gray to something with actual color in it, the city shedding its winter weight and becoming itself again with the particular enthusiasm of a place that has always known the cold was temporary. The ceremony was small. That was Imani's first condition and his first agreement, and it had required a specific kind of negotiation with the infrastructure of what he was, with the people who believed that any event touching the Kang name required a certain scale, a certain visible authority. He had those conversations, and he had won them, and the winning had required him to be very clear about what he was doing and why, which had been its own useful exercise. 14 people. His aside, Min-jun, who stood with the particular controlled emotion of a man who had decided that occasions like this one earned the dropping of his professional face for exactly as long as they required. Oh, the financial director, who brought his wife. Two of Madame Kang's oldest friends, the women who had cried on the phone and whom Imani had asked to be included when Taehyun told her about them, and Mr. Choi, the old veteran from the Mapo Bridge, who had been resettled into the housing program and who arrived in a clean shirt that he had clearly ironed himself and sat very straight through the entire ceremony with an expression of dignified satisfaction. Her side by me, Deja, who had flown in from Atlanta on a leg that still required a slight adjustment in her gait, and who held Imani's hand at the beginning and then sat back and watched with the eyes of someone who was making an assessment that she had been making for 6 months and had recently settled. A colleague from the Hagwon named Ji Yeon, who had been Imani's closest friend in Seoul for 8 months without Imani ever quite articulating to herself how much that friendship had held her up. 2 teachers from the Ipieka program she'd been part of, who arrived together and cried first and longest. The location was the private garden in Syeongbuk-dong, where Madame Kang had kept her small house and spent her clearest mornings. The garden was not large. It had a stone wall along one side and a very old ginkgo tree at its center, and a view of the hillside above Bukchon that in spring looked like someone had torn open a green and pink seam in the city's gray fabric. There was one empty chair. It was at the front, to the left, and on it was folded a cream-colored shawl that had been Madame Kang's. The one she'd kept on the arm of the chair in her hospital room. The one her hands had worried at during the long conversations he'd had with her in the final weeks. He had brought it without planning to. He had found it in a box of her effects and put it in his jacket pocket the morning of the ceremony without consciously deciding to. And it was Min-jun who had seen him arrive with it and found the chair and placed it there without being asked. Imani saw the chair when she came into the garden. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Taehyun. He said nothing. She nodded once, the smallest nod, the kind that contained the most. And then she looked forward, and the ceremony began. It was not long. Neither of them had wanted long. What they had said to each other over the months since the stone lane in Bukchon, in the Ayondong studio, and in the penthouse that was slowly becoming something more habitable and less museum, in convenience stores, and in the car on the way to the hospital for Madame Kang's memorial, and on the phone at midnight from Atlanta, when Deja's therapy was hard and Imani was tired. All of that had been the real ceremony. What they did in the garden was just the formal acknowledgement of a thing that had already been decided in rain and stone lanes and hospital corridors, and one phone call made at 11 at night because it seemed right. When it was done, Deja hugged her sister for a long time. Mr. Choi shook Taehyun's hand with both of his own and said, "She's good people, that one," with the authority of a man who had learned to read character from the ground up. Minjun said nothing. He just held Taehyun's gaze for a moment, with the expression of a man who has decided that some things don't require words and who has been right about that his entire adult life. Jiyeon took photographs that no one asked her to take and that everyone later was glad existed. They ate at a table in the garden, simple food, the kind you could hold in your hands, deliberately unchosen from the kind of catering that announced itself. Mrs. Huang from the Galbi restaurant where Imani had worked had made 2 dishes that she arrived with herself, having been told about the occasion by Ji-yeon, presenting them with the brisk authority of a woman who had decided that her contribution was non-negotiable and being correct about that. Deja sat beside Taehyun at one point during the meal when the other conversations had redistributed around the garden and gave him a look that was not hostile but was not soft either. The look of someone who had been evaluating a person for 6 months and had arrived at conclusions she was going to share whether asked or not. "You hurt her," Deja said. "Yes," he said. "And you know why it was wrong. Not just that it was wrong." "Yes." She looked at him with those eyes that were going to make someone's courtroom very uncomfortable in a few years. "She doesn't heal easy," she said. "She seems like she does because she keeps moving, but she doesn't. It goes deep, and it stays." "I know." "Then you know that if it happens again—" She stopped. "It won't be me you have to deal with. She'll deal with it herself. She always does." A pause. "I'm just saying she doesn't deserve more of it." "No," he said, "she doesn't." Deja looked at him for one more moment. Then she picked up her food and turned back to the conversation beside her, which was the whole verdict delivered in the specific economy of a person who says exactly what is required and stops there. He thought, she's going to be a very good lawyer. The bedroom in the Yeo Uido penthouse had changed. Not dramatically, he had not performed transformation for its own sake. But the things that had made it a museum of himself had been sorted, slowly, over months. The art that had been chosen by someone else's assessment put in storage. The furniture rearranged into something that had a shape reflecting how 2 people actually moved through a space, rather than how a space announced itself. There were things of Imani's distributed through the apartment with the naturalness of actual habitation. A jacket on the chair, a Korean language textbook she was working through again with the patience of someone who understood that competence required time, a photograph of her mother on the bookshelf in the study next to the good lamp. One night in the early summer, she came into the study and found him at the desk, finishing something that needed to be finished before morning. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the photograph of her mother, and then at him. "She would have liked you," Imani said. "If she'd met you. She had a thing about people who didn't perform. She could always tell." He looked at the photograph. A woman with Imani's eyes and the specific quality in her face of someone who had looked at difficult things directly. What would she have said about me? Imani thought about it. She would have said you carry too much alone. She looked at him, and then she would have made you eat something. He looked at the lamp making its small circle of light and thought about his grandmother in her chair, about 30 nights of convenience store walls, about a stone lane in November, about what it cost and what it gave back. "What do you want?" she asked. Not practically. The bigger version. He thought about it honestly. "This," he said. "What's already here?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she came into the study and sat on the edge of the desk, which was not very professional of her and which he did not mind at all. And she picked up the photograph of her mother and looked at it for a while in the quiet of the room with the lamp on and the city doing its enormous indifferent business outside the window. In the bedroom, in the frame on the wall that she had found one morning, 3 months into the new life in the penthouse and had not asked about because she already knew, the $20 bill rested where he had placed it. Soft and worn and creased from 47 days in a jacket pocket, behind glass, in a frame he had chosen himself. Not because it was the beginning of a story. Not because it was the largest thing that had ever happened to him, though it was. But because it was the truest evidence he owned that once, on a cold October night in the rain, a woman with her last $20 had looked at a man on the pavement and seen a person who was worth stopping for. And because he had spent 32 years surrounded by people who wanted what he controlled, and then one night a stranger had wanted nothing except for him to get out of the cold. And because some things, once held, do not let go. And because the woman who had framed the receipt and hung it on the wall of her Ninepyeong studio had understood, even before he did, that what happened in the rain was not the beginning of a test. It was the beginning of an answer.